Hi, everyone. Hello and welcome to all of you joining us today on Zoom or watching live on the Facebook page of the Arab Political Science Network. My name is Ahmed Morsi. I'm a co-founder of the Arab Political Science Network and currently a visiting fellow at the Middle East Council on Global Affairs in Qatar. Before I share more about today's session and introduce our speakers, let me remind you that this session is recorded and there is simultaneous Arabic interpretation through Zoom, so please feel free to just look down at the bottom bar at Zoom and pick Arabic for your interpretation. You can also send questions through the Q&A button as well in the Zoom platform. Today's session is War and the Economy, and it's the third session in a five-part series that is titled Politics and War in the Middle East and North Africa, which is a collaboration between the Arab Political Science Network, the Center for Economic, Legal, and Social Studies and Documentation, CEDEJ, and the Middle East Studies Program at the American University in Cairo. We will share more information in the chat about the project and other upcoming opportunities, and also information about the next two sessions that will take place in April and May, in case any of you are interested. Our panelists today will look at the changing nature of economic activities throughout and as an outcome of wars. How do regimes, non-state actors, and the populations survive? What are the new socioeconomic dynamics that emerge post-war, and how wars consolidate such outcomes? There are a lot of other questions that I'm sure will come out of this conversation and from the expertise that the three of them are bringing to us today. I'd like to introduce my colleagues and friends. Shana Marshall is Associate Director of the Institute for Middle East Studies and Assistant Research Professor at George Washington University. Her dissertation, The New Politics of Patronage, the Arms, Trade, and Clientelism in the Arab World, examined how Middle East governments use arms sales agreements to channel financial resources and economic privileges to pro-regime elites. Shana is currently working on research that looks at patterns of military entrepreneurship in Egypt, Jordan, and the UAE. Omar Dahi is a professor of economics at Hampshire College, and he has previously held various roles at the college, including as faculty trustee and interim vice president for academic affairs and dean of faculty. Omar is a founding director of numerous initiatives, including the Security in Context and the Beirut School of Critical Security Studies within the Arab Council for Social Science. He has published numerous academic and non-academic outlets, and his latest book was South-South Trade and Finance in the 21st Century, Rise of the South or a Second-Grade Divergence, and it's co-authored with Firad Dimir. And last but not least, Joseph Daher, who completed his doctorate in development studies at SOAS in the University of London, and the Doctorate of Political Science at Lausanne University. And he's the author of Hezbollah, the Political Economy of the Party of God, and Syria After the Uprisings, the Political Economy of State Resilience. Welcome to the three of you. I'm excited about this conversation. I think the topic of war economies do not get as much focus, and I think it's about time that we bring it back to the forefront, and it's important for us today because it's part of this series that talks about politics and war. And of course, in light of the downfall of the Assad regime in December, a lot of other questions that have been happening, not to mention the past year and a half or almost of war in Palestine, the genocide that Israel has started, which also brings other questions on the survival, economically speaking, at least, of organizations like Hezbollah or Hamas or otherwise. I'll start by posing one big question for each of you that I would appreciate your insights in, kind of looking at it and through your research or expertise. How did we become, or how did we come to think about war economies in the broader sense of social science, political science, or other interdisciplinary approaches? I would appreciate if each of you can take like 5 minutes to kind of give us a sense and a context of how you understand it and what does it mean and how does it mean in your research. I'll start with Omar, and then Shana, and then Joseph. So Omar, please.
Hi, Ahmed. Thank you so much. Hello, everybody. Very happy to be here. I want to thank all the organizations, AUC, CEDEJ, and the Arab Political Science Network for organizing this and inviting me. It's great to speak alongside Shayna and Joseph, and I'm looking forward to hearing from them and learning from this conversation as well. So yeah, I mean, you posed a general question to us to start off with before we get into the kind of the details of, what's happening, I guess, in the cases that we're studying. But I'm not a political scientist by training. I got my master's and PhD in an economics department at the University of Notre Dame in the United States, which at that time was known as a heterodox economics department, which in the US context at least, it means it's a department that had mainstream economic theory, which what we call neoclassical economic theory, as well as non-mainstream, which includes Keynesian, feminist, institutional, and Marxist political economy. And I think I got exposed to the concept of war economy for the first time there, but in a very different context than maybe the one that we're going to be speaking about. But I think it's related, and that's why I wanted to start off by talking about kind of my trajectory of how I encountered this notion. And it's basically by reading the works of kind of radical political economists, specifically American radical political economists, and the notion of war economies in the context of the advanced industrial economies of the West, and particularly the United States. As a graduate student, I read the work of, Paul Sweezy, Paul Baran. There's a work by Sam Bowles, Thomas Weisskopf, and David Gordon called Beyond the Wasteland, about the US kind of political economy. We also read the work of Michael Koleski in graduate school, which has a very famous article called The Political Aspects of Full Employment, where he talks about the armament economy. He doesn't call it the war economy, he calls it the armament economy, which is kind of characteristics of capitalist economies that want to achieve full employment, but also run up against right-wing or business interests that don't like full employment, either ideologically or because they give the workers too much power. And so my first notion of war economy was really in thinking about how the US economy in particular is essentially a war economy in the sense of the massive expenditures on war preparation and war making, on the arms industry, on the spread of basically the kind of the military and kind of armaments throughout in terms of kind of direct expenditures, indirect expenditures, and the ties that it has downstream to the private sector as well. So that really influenced my thoughts of war economy, and I had no idea at that time about kind of people who work on peace and conflict, who work about kind of economics within kind of civil wars and civil conflicts. That's something I had to learn about because I'm from Syria and I have a particular interest in Syria and kind of got to know those aspects later. And we'll talk about that a little bit maybe down as there when we get to that. But, I live in Western Massachusetts and I always tell my students, I teach, classes on kind of international security. We live in what's considered a very beautiful, idyllic type kind of the country. But even where we live here, I point to my students the ways that war is all around us. So I live in Western Massachusetts. 30 minutes away from me is what's called the Springfield Armory, which was the main producer of weapons for the US Army for 200 years. And not only that, it was the place where the system of interchangeable parts was invented. So the foundation of modern industrial capitalism came out of the Springfield Armory in many ways. And that down the road in terms of kind of its influence on assembly lines, on quality control, on accounting and business management techniques, and so on. Kind of hinting for how we think about kind of modern capitalism as emanating from this kind of war economy in the US. We have here, King Philip's War and the Pequot War took place in this area, some of the bloodiest wars in US history that took place immediately kind of after the kind of initial pilgrims came in the early 1600s, Mayflower 1620, and these wars happened right after. So warfare and war making is endemic to the US. Counterinsurgency, mass murder, genocides happen there, and we're in, kind of part of the foundations of this modern warfare. We also have something interesting, which is a hollowed out mountain That's a nuclear bunker, actually, which was meant to be the strategic command and control place for the US after a Soviet nuclear strike. And now it's used as a repository for the 5 college kind of books. So, warfare is all around us in the US. That really kind of shaped my initial outlook. And then we come to kind of looking at the Middle East and my commitment to kind of Middle Eastern political economy, particularly since the Arab uprisings and particularly in Syria, where we saw everything that we know has happened in the war, which we'll talk about in a second. And that really caused me to think about how can we think of war economies, but within a global context. And this is something that I come back to. It's hard for me to think about anything, whether it's war economies or anything else that I study, in isolation of the global world system that is hierarchical, that is based on unequal exchange, which was kind of part of my training as an economist in kind of uneven development and structuralist kind of Keynesian economics. So all of those kind of played a role in how I came to think about the kind of cases that I studied.
Great. Thank you, Omar, for giving us this, also your introduction into that field and how you also read it, how you see it. And Shana, you did political economy, you did work on militaries, whether it's the US or countries in the region. Again, if you can guide us through how you got introduced, what can you tell us about your journey of recognizing all of these intricate details and how they are connected to each other? Please.
Thank you. And thanks so much for organizing everything, Ahmed, and thank you for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here. Similar to what Omar said at the very end, is that I take a very, I guess, transnational or global approach to sort of understanding this issue. And I'm really very much focused on the military industrial complex, or the MIC. A lot of people, when you hear that phrase, they think you're talking about the US military industrial complex. But I'm really very interested in the global military industrial complex, because these companies are not national companies in any sort of meaningful sense. They're usually collaborating and coordinating and engaged in joint production and in joint research and development with multiple countries at any given time. So it's very, I think, problematic to try to think of it from a nationalist or a nation state sort of perspective. And when I initially began my research, I actually found some documents that had been filed in the incorrect place in the US government documents repository, which is at the University of Maryland, which is where I did my PhD. And I came across some documents from the General Government Accountability Office, the GAO, which is like our auditing sort of agency for the US government. And they were talking about offset contracts with particularly Egypt, Israel, Greece, and Turkey. So offset agreements are basically these sort of complementary contracts that are signed alongside major arms deals. So, for example, in the Egyptian case, the Egyptians were acquiring a large number of military tanks from General Dynamics, which is a US-based firm. And in exchange for purchasing these contracts using US military assistance funds, the Egyptians said, we would like you to build a factory here in Egypt and then send the tanks to Cairo as what they call knockdown kits, right? So all of the parts are there, but the assembly of the final tank itself would take place in a factory in Egypt. And so General Dynamics got the contract to actually build the assembly plants, the factories in Egypt. And they still, to this day, 45, 50 years later, still have that contract, to deliver a certain number of tanks every year. And so members of the US Congress were asking questions about this contract, about these offset contracts, and they call them offset contracts because they're meant to offset the cost of acquiring US military equipment for foreign countries. And in the case of Egypt, of course, because the tanks were free, members of Congress were saying, wait a minute, how are we giving the Egyptians these tanks for free? And then they're turning around and making these reciprocal demands from the US government to also finance the construction of the factory itself. And so I thought, this sounds kind of crazy. I've been studying the military-industrial complex for a while. I've never heard of offset contracts. And as it turns out, they exist in, almost probably 100%, right, of arms agreements. But they're not published. It's very secretive. It's considered proprietary by the firms themselves. Because they don't want their competitor firms to know the kinds of deals that procuring countries are getting in exchange for purchasing these large weapons systems. One of the most famous offset contracts are the Al Yamama contracts between BAE, which is British Aerospace, and Saudi Arabia in the early 80s, I believe. And they're particularly famous because of the extraordinary levels of corruption and bribery that were sort of wound up in those offset contracts. But the long-term impact of that has been to basically build up indigenous military-industrial complexes in the countries where the U.S. exports weapons, in the countries that purchase weapons from the U.S. Because they will say, the Saudis, for example, say, okay, we're going to purchase these planes, these fighter jets, and in exchange, we would like you to build a facility here in Saudi Arabia where we can assemble the cockpit pieces. Or in the UAE, we'd like you to, set up a factory where we can make wing components for the fighter jets. And so basically, you get sort of a locked-in arrangement or relationship where you have guaranteed follow-on contracts, right? Because if the Emirates has a factory where they're building components for those fighter jets, they want to ensure that there is repeat business going into that factory and that those jobs remain there. So they're going to turn around and continue to buy additional fighter jets from that same firm. And so the exporting firms, the military firms, really like offset contracts because it guarantees future business, and also because they inflate the cost of the central military contract to cover the cost of setting up the factory, and usually add even a little bit more on top, right? Because these contracts are extremely complex. And the US government has basically made it impossible for the procuring country to see what the real costs of those contracts are and to challenge whether or not those are sort of feasible costs. And so it's very good for the military industrial complex firms because they end up making a lot of money off of that. And so this sort of exchange and the outsourcing of military industrial supply chains to all of these countries around the world really made me rethink what is a military industrial complex, and to see it in this very transnational and sort of global perspective. And it really helps you understand why there are domestic constituencies in all of these countries that are constantly pressuring and demanding and sort of acceding to demands for new arms sales. And that was really that's the way I look at it. That's when I'm thinking about war economies. It's very much about the private sector interests that drive the growth of those economies, not necessarily for strategic reasons, right? But very much for sort of their own sort of financial bottom lines.
Well, thank you, Jana, for this introductory, also informative information about how you came across that. But it's indeed, as you kind of continue to do entrepreneurship for the military-industrial complex, that's entrepreneurship before it became entrepreneurship as we know today in the tech world. Joseph, I'd like to come to you. You have done graduate degrees in development and political science, which probably meant that you engaged with economic components across the disciplines. And if you can just give us a sense of how you got to focus more critically and clearly on political economic aspect, whether on Lebanon or Syria, to just start us off, and then we will come back to the work that the three of you have done to kind of dig deeper into it.
Thank you, Ahmad. I would like to thank all the organizers for doing this important event and very interesting and learning a lot. And it's a pleasure to be alongside Shana and Omar as well. And hopefully we can have a fruitful discussion. So yeah, my encounter with war economies is a bit different. First, it was the issue when treating or analyzing Lebanon's political economy or Syria's political economy. In the past decade or even before, there was a trend in academia, but moreover, generally to separate basically dynamics of war economies with the general dynamics of political economy, which I thought was partly problematic because war economies very often, if you want, deepened some dynamics that were present in these societies, for example, Syria, Lebanon, prior to the war, and were not completely separated of political economic dynamics, that not everything could be only limited or restricted to there was a very much targeting and focus on illicit economies, and even the fact of tackling illicit economies separate from the political economy of these countries were problematic because, as Omar was mentioning it before, we are in countries of the periphery with unequal and combined development, and informal economy in which you do have illicit, but not only illicit economies, is very much part of these economies and have been existing prior to the wars. If we look at, for example, smuggling dynamics, or within the private sector, sections of the micro and small medium enterprise were part of the informal, with them officially illegal as well. So it was problematic to me to see that the war economy were completely separated of the bigger picture of the political economy, and especially regarding neoliberal dynamics. So in both countries, what we witnessed, Lebanon and Syria, and also I studied a bit, but a bit less, the case of Iraq from the 80s and after in the post-war 2003, is that the wars were also enjoined, whether for the state elites or non-state sometimes groups, to encourage and to foster prior neoliberal dynamics present in these societies, especially focusing on dynamics regarding trade, finance, basically non-productive sectors of the economy, because also you had destructions of these societies, of the productive sectors, whether manufacturing, agriculture, but also from above, from the state elites, as I was saying, but also non-state actors. So pushing forward what we witnessed prior to the wars, for example, in the case of Syria, focusing mostly on trade dynamics, finance, etc. But in Lebanon as well, also on this aspect. And also, if we look at the response that we're giving to humanitarian assistance from the 90s and afterwards, a focus on, any kind of economic recovery should be based on the private sector that is playing more and more crucial role, and downplaying the role of the state. Similarly, in the case, if you look at during, war economies in the case of Syria, big focus, but elsewhere in the world as well, in various war situations, focus, for example, on cash assistance rather than supporting, national production, manufacturing, rather distributing cash because it gives more freedom, brackets, to the consumer. So there's also this idea of promoting the consumption dynamics, which were problematic. Also seeing that, you have a mix between, in this kind of accumulation of capital, new networks of businessmen emerging, but also very often with former, business elite also being mixed with these rising new elites during the war. And also what is interesting when it comes to the war economies is also the answer giving to the so-called post-war economies. Also here, this like kind of a complete separation being made in academia, but more generally as well. Also the answer given to what kind of economic recovery. And when we look at Lebanon, Iraq, or Syria, but also elsewhere in the world, if we look at ex-Yugoslavia after the war, or Rwanda, it's a focus again on neoliberal dynamics, accumulation of capital focused on trade, finance, rather than on the productive sectors of the economy. Also, a reconstruction process reproducing socioeconomic inequalities that were present during and prior to the war. We can see this, for example, in the case of Lebanon, you know, the reconstruction process, or the so-called reconstruction process, because that became a model, solidaire, and this is what Syrians are very scared of for the future, and was also a plan of the former Assad regime, but I think continuing with the new regime that we have in Syria, the construction of the new regime, is also a reconstruction process focusing very much on dynamics of short-term profit capital accumulation, again, non-productive sectors of the economy, which are problematic. We've seen the case in Lebanon, Iraq, and I believe it's unfortunately the road taken by the current authorities in Syria, reproducing socioeconomic injustice, reproducing underdevelopment, and continuity and deepening of what we've seen during the war and prior to the war in terms of capital accumulation. And therefore, there's a lot of, also when it came to whether being, occupying forces in Iraq or new or continuous ruling elite in Lebanon, willingness to privatize major economies of state assets, liberalization of prices. And you see this as a kind of, a model to follow a bit everywhere. Also, I think it's important what was mentioned both by Shana and Omar to have a transnational perspective and how dominant the neoliberal paradigm is also in so-called post-war economies and in reproducing basically socioeconomic inequalities and underdevelopment, and kind of also the role played by both the IMF, World Bank, or the European, European banks, etc. So we can see here common, I think, elements, factors regarding war economies and their dynamics, how they are treated as completely separated from dynamics of larger political economies. And one word that I will conclude on this, that whether being wars, economic crisis, health crisis like the COVID, is generally used by the ruling elite to deepen austerity measures or prior neoliberal dynamics. And wars are not different in this perspective.
Great, thank you very much. This has been a very interesting, but also very kind of overarching description of how this came to be in your career, but also in your research. I want to, I have a lot of questions, so I would appreciate if you kind of engage with them short so we can have multiple rounds. And I want to start with the research, Omar, that you've done on Syria. And you have a piece that came out last year in October, the Syria war economy. And I'd like for you to kind of tell us more about this piece. How does it fit in this broader war economies kind of conversation? And how does it look different today from the time when you wrote it, since now there is no more Assad regime? And how can we think about it today in light of what's happening?
All right, so thank you for that. So that piece came out in a roundtable in the Middle East Law and Governance Journal, which I invite everyone to read if you're interested, because it has my article on Syria, but it has two really interesting articles as well on Jordan and Yemen by Pete Moore and Sean Yom on Jordan and Abir Al-Aryani on Yemen. And the three pieces came out of a project to kind of zoom into the specifics, Ahmed, that you wanted us to talk about. Of one of the foundational texts for us who want to study war economies in the way that we understand them is Stephen Heidemann's edited volume on war, institutions, and social change in the Middle East, right? And I think this is a must read for everyone who really wants to think about war economies. And that really, in conversations with Pete Moore and Sean Yom and Shana and others, of course, is how do we think about, an update to that book? Not an update in the literal sense, but, a lot of that book was written about kind of the early, 20th century to the middle kind of post-war period, when most of these countries were pursuing kind of war making or war preparation, let's say. How do you think about it today? So that's kind of the more immediate lineage of this project and where this roundtable came about. And of course, it's an ongoing kind of exploration. And the particular piece about Syria that you mentioned, Ahmad, was an attempt to kind of think about those questions, a la kind of Heidemann's book, in the Syrian context. Like, how is the Syrian war actually shaping Syrian institutions, aside from when we think of the actions of the government or actions of this party or that party? And there are two kind of ideas that I was pushing against in this article, and I'm happy to talk about the other articles as well because they make really important contributions on Yemen and so on, but in a slightly different way. One idea is that in a war, there's a geopolitics up there and there's a grassroots happening down there. In the case of the Syrian war, you saw a lot of these that, there's the geopolitics, which is the conflict between countries and proxy wars, and then there's the grassroots on the ground or things happening on the ground, and they're often talked about as if they're disconnected from each other. So, we can't focus too much on the geopolitics because we need the grassroots or vice versa. And so that's one kind of binary. And the other binary is this thinking about the policies of the Syrian government, which is kind of attacking the protest movement initially, the widespread human rights violations, and then, pursuing a war against kind of the opposition on the one hand, and then this idea that the international response is pushing back against that, is, the sanctions as pushing back against that, the kind of the actions of the international governments as trying to mitigate the actions of the Syrian government. Whereas my paper tries to challenge both of those binaries. First is that the geopolitics and the actions of the ground are co-constituted, and so too are the actions of the Syrian government and the pushback against it. So it's not like the actions internationally are pushing back against the Syrian government. They're actually creating the war that we know it, whether through the sanctions, whether through the funding and arming and training of opposition groups, whether through the actions of the different regional countries. So really, that was an attempt to think about it from a political economy lens, a war economy, rather than a kind of siloed approach. What would a political economy lens that tries to tie all these things together have us think differently about it? And also putting it in the context of Syrian history before the uprising and let's say the neighborhood that Syria is in before the uprising, thinking about the militarization of the region, thinking about external interventions, thinking about the kind of permanent Israeli belligerence and kind of occupation and the kind of the way that has militarized the regional landscape. So that was really the attempt for that. And basically to kind of share some of the findings quickly, or I shouldn't say some of the findings, but some of the arguments. It's basically that I think that, the kind of institutional distortions that happened as a result of those different actions, the pursuit of the war by the Syrian government, the sanctions, which created a huge macroeconomic shock, actually, to the Syrian economy, in my opinion. They really contributed to the deterioration of the state capacity in Syria to actually even do basic kind of, its basic job, essentially. And so there was as a result, increased predatory behavior, increased informality as a result of that. And there were counterintuitively, perhaps, or, kind of interestingly, attempts from within the Syrian government, let's say, other actions in the Syrian government that were trying to kind of respond to that by initiating some sort of attempt at, counteracting the sanctions through, focusing on, I don't even call it import substitution, but an attempt at kind of grappling with the consequences of the war. But that those events were actually unsuccessful because they were, first of all, that too much damage had been done to state capacity. And second, all the actors who were beneficiaries from the war economy, who were empowered by the Syrian regime and others as middlemen, as smugglers, as basically war profiteers, would really block any attempt kind of on their authority, whether to kind of mobilize revenue, whether to actually initiate some sort of project that responds to this decline. So those are some of the things in the article. I think in terms of what we're witnessing today, I mean, I think this is an important thing to talk about, and I'm glad you brought that up, because I think we're confronting today the legacy of the war, and a lot of the problems facing Syria today is the legacy of the war. The sanctions, for example, which I believe, unless there is a significant movement on the sanctions, the precarious transition, as already difficult as it is, might be sabotaged completely. The fragmentation that resulted as the proxy war and the kind of fragmentation due to different countries supporting different groups, and you had a territorial de facto fragmentation. That's something we're confronting today. The empowerment of groups with an extremist, sectarian, kind of exclusionary outlook on politics. That is a legacy of the war. So I think we are haunted by that legacy today, obviously, and that could derail the transition that Syrians are hoping for.
Well, thank you, Omar. This is useful. I want to go back to Joseph, and then I will move to Shana to give us a broader regional view. But Joseph, you did both Syria and Lebanon. You had this book that worked on political economy of state resilience, and Syria is one of that cases, I would say, not just because of the war that we have witnessed, but also before that, as Omar mentioned, that even all of these kind of war economy or the political economy of these regimes have started even before the uprisings. And then also you worked on a specific case, which is a non-state actor, Hezbollah, which was until recently, till today, very powerful actor in Lebanon, and yet to see what are the outcomes of this transition within the organization and the region would mean for Hezbollah and Lebanon. And I would like you to maybe take from what Omar started us off with his piece and this roundtable conversation about war economies, to maybe reflect on what your book or your arguments have brought in terms of this resilience component, and then maybe shed some light on what Hezbollah represent as a case, because it has been the enigma of all, and the example of a lot of non-state actors that kind of were created or developed after Hezbollah came to being in the 80s.
Okay, so there's two sides to the question. First of all, regarding the resilience of the regime, and I think Omar starts on a point. I finished the book in 2019, which I think is a key separation, division in the war and the uprising in Syria. After 2019, Omar mentioned the sanctions, the Caesar sanctions, but there was also other events, especially the financial crisis in Lebanon. And I totally agree that we cannot separate, political economic dynamics from the ground to the regional and international politics. And this is a huge separation, because if you remember in 2018, end of 2018, the regime had recaptured, after Eastern Aleppo 2016, Rif Dimashq, Damascus countryside, Der'a, etc. It was on a point of, more of we're in a period where we believe that the regime had, basically survived because of the assistance also given by Russia and Iran. But also what is important, and I totally agree with the challenges they faced the regime, but also the dynamics that, sanctions, illicit economic growing. There was also, as I was saying before, an opportunity was of the deepening of the crisis was used by, if you want, the presidential palace, and what was represented in terms of class dynamics, class orientation. And what we heard in the 2000s regarding subsidies, liberalization of and privatization of state assets, even health, education, were or announced or put in, implemented within Syria. So this is why I was saying the dynamics. And therefore, I think here, one of the reasons is obviously the fall of the regime is due to the lack of assistance being provided, or they were weakened, Iran, Hezbollah, and Russia. But the second one is the loss of any kind of popular legitimacy of this regime, especially after 2019. People not willing to, especially soldiers in the Syrian Arab army, willing to sacrifice themselves for salaries of $20, $25. And this was a complete consequence of its economic policies that were obviously influenced by local, regional, and international politics. But the fact is that these economic policies brought also its end. It wasn't even able to sustain a minimum of popular kind of legitimacy or support even. So this is one thing on why I believe the regime was not able to be resilient after 2019. I think it's a crucial period to understand the separation. After, when it comes to Hezbollah, what is important to understand is that very often when we come to basically Islamic fundamentalist movement, we stop using basic social science tools or political economy. It's that like they're outside of framework of science, which I think it's a complete mistake, and there's a form of Orientalism and essentialism towards the political parties that should be studied just like any kind of other political party. And Hezbollah is basically being, still a very important political actor, but has suffered major, I would say, defeat in some way, especially regarding the Israeli war on Lebanon. And not only on Hezbollah, important to say, was on the whole of Lebanon, just like in 2006, but moreover also the fall of the Assad regime. And here, coming back to the political economy, the fall of the Assad regime was not only a loss in terms of geopolitics, transfer of weapons, etc., but a loss of capital accumulation. What Hezbollah also after 2019, here also the economic crisis, its intervention in Syria is important. Obviously, it was done firstly to geopolitical dynamics, but throughout times, it accumulated, it became a source of capital accumulation, whether through smuggling, but also real estate, etc. And this is, I believe, also a big loss. It was also transfer of liquidity. What we're seeing with today for Hezbollah, it's much more difficult for the reconstruction, also for the crisis of transfer of liquidity, etc. So Hezbollah is basically, the major difference, I would say, with the rest of the Lebanese political actors. It is a Lebanese political actors, but its main dynamics of capital accumulation are outside of Lebanon. This is not per se only Hezbollah, because if you saw Rafiq al-Hariri business in the 90s was also political economy, most of capital accumulation outside. But its most revenues are from a state, Iran, and also partially it was through Syria and within. And these are being attacked through various ways. Again, I think what Omar was saying, internationally, locally is important. Sanctions, but also the Lebanese state. So to answer and to conclude, because I know I'm being long, but it was two difficult questions. Hezbollah, I believe, will remain a main key Lebanese political actors with its regional influence very much undermined, but still a model to follow, with differences, because if you look at Iraq, they've been mostly integrated popular mobilization unit with the state. But also the difference is that Hezbollah within Lebanon, its popular base will not leave the party without a popular alternative, which is unfortunately absent until today. I mean, the main opposition party is the Lebanese force of Samir Jarja, which is not at all attractive for the majority of Lebanese Shia popular classes. I hope I answered your question.
Well, I mean, I think we can have sessions and sessions talking about these intricate dynamics and how they continue to overlap between the politics and the economics and the social. And I think, Shana, you started us off in your remarks at the beginning talking about these anomalies, this kind of entrepreneurial, but also the relationship that got built within the military-industrial complexes, whether it's in the US as the biggest producer of weapons, biggest armament kind of supplier, and also expenditure, and some of the regimes in the region, some of the countries in the region that are known as allies of the United States, until when think Trump is going to also define new forms of alliances, I think, moving forward. But I would like to step away from this just specific war conversation and look at how also, or maybe ask you to reflect on how some of these countries in the region have been building these industrial complexes that is not only for military purposes, but also have kind of hijacked its own economic kind of infrastructure. And what does it mean moving forward? And I think there is a question here, I mean, it's a long question in the Q&A about the perception of economic impact on security expenditures. Again, how the uncertainties and fears that is now being exaggerated and increased will lead to more expenditure and more loss of economic activity that goes towards buying weapons or manufacturing weapons and so on and so forth. I know it's a lot, but I think reflecting on some of these elements would be very helpful for us, because some of these countries are not necessarily at war, but they are behaving like they are actually at war.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, the question of the impact, I guess, of arms expenditures as a component of a war economy is an empirical question, right? Like we can say whether or not it is the case that spending money on weapons and militarization has a positive or negative impact on the economy. It's a settled question. There's plenty of research on this, and the consensus is that it has a negative impact on the economy. So if you want to talk about jobs, I mean, in the US, this is the perennial sort of justification for investment in the military industrial complex, is that it produces high quality, well-paying jobs. But the truth is that you could create, many, many, many more good paying, secure jobs in a non-military sector for the same amount of money, right? So if your primary concern is job creation, then investing in the military industrial complex is absolutely not the most efficient or effective way to get there. So that is an empirical question. There is a yes or no answer to that question, and the answer to that question is no. It's not. It is not beneficial. Of course, this is all tied up with these sort of geostrategic questions, right? So, in the region, for example, Saudi Arabia and the Emirates have devoted enormous sums of money to growing their own indigenous military industrial complexes, often purchasing firms from Europe, from the US, and from sort of some second tier sort of arms producers, basically transferring the production line basically into their own country, purchasing the intellectual property, in many cases bringing over the engineers and the executives, luring them with very high paying jobs with huge research and development budgets, and bringing that sort of just wholesale into the Arab Gulf states. They're building up research units and departments within science focused universities. They have a lot of scholarship programs for students now in Gulf countries who are focused on sort of defense tech and defense science. And there's an enormous amount of investment from Gulf state funds and from individual wealthy investors in the Gulf in militarized tech firms and in military industry firms that still exist in the US and Europe. So there's an enormous amount of capital flowing from the Gulf into the global military industrial complex. And we all know, the people here at least, know that although Saudi Arabia is a very wealthy state, there are a lot of very poor people. There is a lot of poverty in Saudi Arabia. A lot of Americans probably don't know that. A lot of Westerners probably don't know that. But yeah, the use of this money to pursue and to grow a military industrial complex at the expense of poverty alleviation and civilian infrastructure for things like climate change, adaptation, and other really important priorities is definitely a net drain on the economy. Of course, there's a lot of very extremely poor Americans too, which a lot of people in the Middle East probably, or, may not be super familiar with. A lot of, students when they come to study in the U.S. are like, wow, I had no idea there was this level of poverty in the United States, but there is an enormous amount. And so, yes, this is basically, investment in the military-industrial complex is extremely detrimental to the economy. And of course, the issue of arms races, right? This is a big part of political science, of the discipline of political science and the study of war, is that preparing for war essentially becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? As you build up your military-industrial complex, as you spend more on war, as you mobilize for war in defense of some, potential future conflict, it essentially causes other countries in the region to respond by doing the same. And then war is much more likely to break out under those circumstances. So there is very many sort of patterns, global patterns, like the rise of austerity politics, which doesn't touch, of course, military spending in any country. The extraordinary concentration of wealth, which makes securitization in like gated communities and the rise of private security makes all of these things much more consequential. The extraordinary levels of capital accumulation that allow for private investment in the military-industrial complex, not just state spending, but private spending in that sector. All of these things sort of combine to feed into this sort of monster of a war economy that only further immiserates and impoverishes, individuals, civilians, and states at the expense of sort of, for the benefit of these sort of military actors and government security, basically regime security, because that is fundamentally sort of their number one priority. It is not necessarily the things that a state should be doing. In the current sort of environment of scarcity. So.
Thank you, Shana. This is very helpful, and I know that probably we'll go over the hour. So if you don't mind staying 10 minutes after the hour, that would be great. I think there are some questions and reflections that would be great to have you kind of put us into kind of perspective. And I'd like to specifically ask Joseph, post-war, Lebanon, its constitutional system, power sharing agreements, the post-Ta'if kind of setup, kind of consolidated dynamic, politically and economically, that we are still facing or seeing today. And every sect or every group kind of consolidated a space within the economic structure of Lebanon. And that's what we continued with. If you can just briefly, in 2 minutes, if you can just tell us is there a chance to get out of this without another civil war or without some other outside intervention that kind of change this? Because I think I'd like Omar as well to kind of think us through the post-Syria, post-Assad infrastructure, the economy structure. How can also what have been consolidated in the past 14, 15 years at least kind of change and make Syrians think differently about the state of the economy and socioeconomic development moving forward? So, Joseph.
Yes, I think first on Lebanon, what we witnessed post-Ta'if was a reflection also of the changes in the political economy of the elite networks. So a kind of re-equalization between the various fractions of the Lebanese bourgeoisie, mostly in favor of the Sunni and Shia fraction of the bourgeoisie at the expense of the Maronite one. And this was, reflected in the kind of post-Ta'if agreement, in which we shouldn't forget they had the domination of the same regime also. and with the actually at the time the support or the of the US and the Saudi Arabia as well. But when it and the post-IF agreement also, and this is how we see the continuation between war and post-war economies. Basically, the main ruling actors that were mostly present during the war continued and politically, but also economically deepened neoliberal dynamics and underdevelopment of the Lebanese economy, especially focusing on trade, finance, and service, and also the construction industry, because its short-term profit returns, while the productive sectors of the economy were even more undermined. So, and this was, I think, one of the problems with the popular uprising in 2019, is that the voices that were the most organized and won in parliament was kind of the liberal strata that focused only on corruption. And obviously, we all want a society without corruption, but this is not enough. There was not an alternative bring forward what kind of political economy do we want as an alternative. So there was no challenge to the lack of social security, of the role of the banks as pillars of the economy. And therefore, I believe any kind of rupture of what I call the Lebanese neoliberal sectarian system needs a rupture with also the political economy of Lebanon, and therefore its ruling strata. But this goes through, the reconstruction of social movements from below, trade unions that were basically also destroyed following the post-war civil war, because they were the main actors able to bring in Lebanese popular classes from various popular sects. So or they were co-opted or destroyed. And in both cases, we had the CEDEJ, the General Federation of Lebanese Workers, and afterwards the Union Coordination Committee through Hana Gharib in the 2008. Both were broken. And therefore, this is the biggest challenge, I think, in Lebanon, also in Syria. In Syria, the problem is that whether the current government or the majority of the opposition is not suggesting any kind of political economic alternative. It's not about stopping privatization, for example, or cutting subsidies. It's how much do we go? If you see the National Conference of Dialogue, it wasn't about a new political or another kind of political economic alternative. And this is also problematic, because this means basically 99% of the population will not be able to participate in any kind of political transition if they're not able to survive on a daily basis. So this is why how much political economy, I believe, is important. But the problem we're a bit in, still in a, even though this kind of, events are important, there's no alternative to neoliberal dynamics, basically, for the majority of political parties. So this is really a problem. And that goes back prior to 2011 in Syria. Even the issue of socio-economic justice was not a strong pillar of the majority, of the opposition.
Omar, I'd like you also to kind of reflect on this point where now we're seeing this struggle within Syria. It seems, at least from colleagues and friends who have been to Syria and in and out, and the conversation about like liberalizing the economy, open up, just to give up on or get rid of what have been happening since the 50s, maybe, not just the past 15 years. And to what extent the Syrian context today, how can we understand it post-war, but also, as you mentioned earlier, the sanctions. There are still sanctions exist, even if there is some alleviation of it by some actors here and there, they are still in place, and it could easily come back and can haunt any country that tries to support the new Syrian regime or the new Syrian leaders in effect. So if you can just, again, through your reflections, guide us through this, that would be great.
Yeah, it's a fluid situation, obviously, as Joseph was mentioning, and it's good to learn about the lessons from Iraq and from Lebanon. What happened in Syria is interesting because you don't see in recent history a lot of armed groups coming to power after overthrowing a government anymore. Right? You used to see that in, maybe in the 50s and 60s, in the kind of revolutionary eras. But, you know, if we abstract from the fact that this is Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, like it's an armed group, that's an insurgent group, right, that toppled the government. And so that opens the door for the possibility of actually an economic reconfiguration of who the elites will be, right? There are already signs that, you know, some of the contracts or some of the policies might be favoring businesses tied to the ruling elites. I was in Syria in February for a brief period of time, and also, like many Syrians, and like Joseph, of course, and others, constantly talking to Syrians. And so there, it's, you know, it's not clear who the, you know, who will be excluded and who will be included, right, in this new. Will it be the continuation of the old elites? Will it be, I mean, some of the old elites or established elites are already feeling excluded, that, you know, we thought this might be our time. We were against the government, but now feeling themselves on the outskirts of the decision making. So it'll be something to track and see what's going to happen with that. Definitely, there is the discussions that you mentioned and Joseph mentioned. And I think from reading kind of other periods of transition, it's not just that there's a neoliberal ideology because they believe in it from an economic perspective, but because they believe this is the best way to destroy the old regime, that the old regime's power came from the public sector, right? That there's this kind of deep state in the public sector, and to destroy that state. I mean, this happened in, you know, I read this really based on a student of mine who was doing on the Polish transition, called From Solidarity to Sellout, Tadeusz Kowalik. He wrote it about the transition in Poland, about basically how it was not so much that they're deeply neoliberal in that they believe neoliberalism will deliver, as much as that this is the way to destroy and have communism and socialism never come back to the country. So I think there's an element of that in Syria, right? That the public sector is where you see, and even there's a sectarian dimension to this, that you see Alawis in the public sector and so on. So there's an undertone of it, of sectarianism. That's obviously deeply problematic. A post-conflict landscape is one where you need the public sector. There are estimates that half of the people employed in what previously we called regime-held areas were employed by the government. At a time when 80% people are in dire need or are in need of assistance, you're essentially throwing people on the street, so to speak, to put it that way. This idea is problematic because I think for many people, the interim government does not have the legitimacy to radically reconfigure Syrian political economy. So there's that threshold, which they haven't passed. The second is, even if they had the legitimacy, did they have actually enough time to study the status quo in all the public sector, to find out what's happening? They just came to power a couple months ago. They didn't have the time to look at what are the strengths and weaknesses and costs and trade-offs of these decisions. And third, even if you pass both of those thresholds, even if you have the legitimacy to do it, which they don't, even if they had the time to study this and come to an informed decision, which they don't, is it pragmatic or wise, even if it's absolutely the correct decision? Is it actually helpful to the transition, or is it going to undermine it? Is it going to create new horizontal inequalities, new fault lines, or exacerbate existing fault lines? And sometimes in a post-conflict situation, you know, even if it's the absolute right decision from a kind of a rational perspective, which I don't think exists, but even for argument's sake, it may not be the wisest thing to do it. And I think it fails all of those things. I think it's unwise and will have really negative consequences. There are other aspects of the Syrian public sector which maybe some people don't know, which is that as many of you and your audience would know, that female labor force participation is very low in the Middle East. But the public sector is the place where you have the most female labor force participation. So if you look at the formal public sector in most countries in the region compared to the formal private sector, you see it's more women in the public sector. In the case of Syria, it's between 6% to 30% in terms of women's kind of labor force participation. And women are more likely to have more advanced and managerial and senior positions as well, not just to have more employment, but also to be higher in the scale of management rather than just kind of low level or entry positions. So there's an anti kind of women aspect of kind of this mass liberalization as well. in kind of employment. And so it counteracts the need to actually increase female kind of labor force participation, to just cite one aspect of this maybe. So there are many problematic aspects. At the same time, if we think about structurally where Syria is now, I mean, I think despite their ideological aversion, from my perspective, the Syrian leadership would be well advised to actually look eastward to China and look towards the other alternatives that are possible, because the West has nothing to offer the global South in terms of development, certainly not the US at this point, and not even Europe, right? And as I think they are ideologically averse, and this is going to take a long time because there's lots of problematic aspects of it, but where does the global South structurally have to go? As critical as I am of kind of uneven developments within the global South, and that was why the subtitle for the book that we wrote was about potential great divergence within the global South. Nevertheless, where else might development, infrastructure development come when, and so on. So these are real problems that we need to think about. And, there's a period of transition. It's uncertain. And I think, we'll still to see where it goes. But I think, the new leadership needs to really think seriously about this from an economic perspective.
I mean, this conversation can go for hours. I realize this, and I'm sorry for trying to push you to wrap your comments. And I think we're in this last round that we'll have to make it very quick. And I would appreciate, Shana, if you take us into things that we should kind of look out for, whether it's within this conversation of military-industrial complexes, whether it's, as one of the colleagues or one of the attendees mentioned, the civilian use of war technology, like in terms of surveillance, AI, and all of that, and how this is kind of controlling civic and civil spaces for the public. Like one or two things that you as a researcher, as someone who's engaged in this field, are looking at, but maybe for all of us to kind of be aware of and to think of. And then I'll come to Joseph and Omar to also give us their kind of like two things that they are, or like trends that they are looking at, so we can maybe hopefully in a couple of months can revisit some of these conversations again.
Yeah, thanks. Great question. What I've looked at pretty seriously for the last several years has been, the role of militarized tech, right? The tech industry and its role in contributing to the military industrial complex. And what I've sort of come to understand through this is that it's very much a supply side story, right? That the impetus for pushing tech, and you could talk about Silicon Valley as a sort of shortcut for tech, has come from secondary financial actors, right? So primarily venture capital investors and private equity firms, and they are using their substantial accumulated capital to push tech firms into developing military technologies, right? So they're militarizing sort of existing tech firms, ones that may do work on, for example, there's one, a medical imaging firm, they were working on better imaging of, for cancer research. And then some venture capital fund came in and said, you'd get a lot more investment a lot faster so that you can go public, and so that you can, do your work better and faster if you developed a military application for this technology. So those investors are militarizing civilian tech, but then they're also investing huge sums into companies like Palantir and Anduril, who are quickly becoming sort of akin to the Lockheed Martins or the BAEs of the past several decades. So they themselves are huge sort of conglomerates almost, because those Anduril and Palantirs are themselves buying up smaller tech firms and incorporating their technologies into these military targeting and surveillance platforms. And because there is such an enormous level of wealth disparity globally, right? On the one hand, you have people who are increasingly living in poverty and living on the margins. Well, where is the money that's being taken from those communities is being accumulated, right, amongst the ruling class, and how is the ruling class sort of expressing that is through venture capital and through private equity funds, and that is just causing a dramatic sort of explosion in the development and the spread of new military technologies. In previous centuries, they might have been building libraries, right, and universities and monuments and opera houses. Well, now they're just starting their own, venture capital and private equity funds, and you don't get a return on building an opera house, and so they're putting the money into these militarized tech sort of spaces, and also because a lot of the sort of tech breakthroughs that we had in previous decades, if you think about cloud computing or mobile devices, right, the smartphone, we're not seeing those sort of massive breakthroughs anymore. And so the money that would have ordinarily sort of flowed into that civilian tech industry sees that if they can partner with state capital, right, government capital, they are very likely to realize those kinds of returns in the development of new military technologies. And so this is what I've really been focusing on, and is a very sort of pessimistic, I think, turn in the future of sort of global capitalism and military and military technology and war more broadly.
Thank you, Shana. Joseph, if you can give us briefly and quickly, like, 2 items or 2 things that you're really watching closely right now within this broader political economy of post-conflict or conflict.
Well, I think I'll go back to my introduction, showing how wars, economic crisis, or even sanitary crisis are used or being used as a way to deepen neoliberal dynamics or strategy measures. We've seen this also in center of capital accumulation in Western states, different crises being used for more privatization, less subsidies, cutting in the health education system. And unfortunately, we're witnessing partially this also in the case of Syria and Lebanon. In the case of Syria, following the overthrow of the Assad regime, I agree with Omar, there's an ideological perspective, but also prior to the way they managed Idlib, etc., there was also already signs, and several statements were quite clear. For example, we're going to pass from a socialist economy to a free and competitive market is also clear. And the way the foreign minister of Syria, Saad al-Shibani, went to the World Economic Forum, which is symbol of the world economic elite, especially Western economic elite, and pushing forward for privatization. So we're witnessing throughout this world this kind of model, and I'm very fearing that Syria will witness more of this kind of political measures, but also witnessing what I think are important maybe symbols of resistance for the beginning. But for example, in Syria, the only kind of protest movement that we have throughout governorates is among state employees that have been laid off or temporarily put aside. So this is quite interesting. There's attempts to try to structure it, coordinate it. And again, here, I think comparative analysis or historic lessons are important. For example, the independent trade unions in Egypt, or the experience of Sudan or in Lebanon. So things to learn. But this is, I believe, what are important to study for the future also of the region, but more generally against this kind of dominant neoliberal paradigm we're living in, unfortunately.
Thank you, Joseph. Omar, last but not least,
Okay, very quickly. Yeah, I mean, in addition to, I think the for us interested in human development and social justice in the region, I think Joseph's question is key. How do we find our way out of this mess? Because we really need to think about that. But one thing I'm looking at, and this is in collaboration with Shana as well. So I'm saying it on air. Shayna, you can't back out of it now. It's on record. It's on the rise on trade in weapons between the South countries, South-South trade in arms. And this has to do with the question posed. Professor Khalid Abu Daha mentioned about AI-driven and drones and satellites and facial recognition. We see a lot of that as increasing South-South trade. So a lot of my interest is on South-South trade in general, but now we're actually taking a look together on this increasing trade between so-called developing countries or global South countries in supplying repression, essentially, supplying weapons, supplying surveillance technologies, policing, and so on. So the dark side of that. Now, why are they doing it? What are their motivations? So we're looking at a little bit what are the drivers of this trade. We're looking at mapping this trade and creating a database, which is very tricky to do because this data seems to be scattered and all over the place. We're looking to look at it through case studies in the Middle East and maybe outside the Middle East. So we're trying to put together a project that looks at this because I think it's going to be key in kind of with this rise of the non-West thinking about these new networks and alliances, which will have their own political economies and coalitions inside developing countries actually driving them. And so, yeah, that's one thing we're looking at. Maybe we could talk about it at a future date.
That's great. And I think just to this point particularly, I have worked at SIPRI, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, which, as some of you or most of you know, they have this annual data report on arms transfer expenditure, and they have been expanding into even doing some AI and tech and military work recently. And I think this component of the South-South trade, whether it's in the military part or the AI and tech space, would be very, very interesting because it was a question when I was at SIPRI of how to measure this, how to actually try to understand it, because as you said, the data is scattered or non-existent because a lot of these countries do not either have a transparency system or the companies that they have purchased are off the stock market or do not have public, data and reporting. So I think it will be a great project to look into. And it also, for me, as we wrap up, I've had this conversation before with Lisa Anderson, Professor Lisa Anderson at Columbia and the former American University in Cairo president, about crisis rent and how this is another space and another area that has been growing. While it's not war economies necessarily, but it's a war elsewhere or a conflict elsewhere where there is a country or a regime that's benefiting the most out of sustaining this. Not necessarily that they are investing in maintaining the conflict, but they are using the opportunity to save themselves from it. And of course, Egypt here comes in the forefront of an example of that, of these countries. Once again, thank you very much for the three of you for giving us this opportunity. I would love for us to continue this through other webinars or hopefully one of the workshops that will be organized sometime later this year with APSN. Again, thank you, stay well, and hopefully we'll talk with you again soon.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Ahmed. Good to see everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.